Richard White stood by the panoramic window of his office in a jewelry store on Pearl Street in downtown Denver. The spring sun reflected off the windows, where diamonds and other jewelry sparkled. But his mind was far from business. "Mr. White, Miss Baker is here to see you about the new collection," the secretary said over the intercom. "Tell her I'm busy," he replied tiredly. "Reschedule all meetings for next week." Richard moved away from the window and sank heavily into a leather chair. On the table was an old photograph of him and Rosie on vacation in Europe. Everything was different then. They were a happy couple then, and now— "You're crazy, man," he muttered, looking at his reflection on the screen of the turned-off laptop. The thought that had appeared last week seemed crazy, but he couldn't shake it. When his old friend Thomas, the owner of a security firm, mentioned that he was looking for a new employee for the Grand Valley apartment complex where Rosie now lived, Richard felt it was a sign. "Tom, I need your help," he said into the phone, dialing his friend's number. "Richard? Is there something wrong with the security system at the store?" "No, it's a personal matter. Can you come over?" An hour later, Thomas was sitting across from him, shaking his head in disbelief. "Are you crazy? You want to get a job as a security guard at your ex-girlfriend's house?" "I need to know the truth." Richard clenched his fists. "There have been rumors lately. They say they saw her with a man. So what? You're divorced. She has a right to privacy. I need to know who he is." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Look, I understand how you feel, but this is crazy. Rosie might recognize you." "No, she won't." Richard took a photo out of the drawer. "Look how I looked when I met Rosie." The 15-year-old photo showed a young man with thick dark hair and a clean-shaven face. Now the mirror reflected a man with gray hair on his temples and a neat beard. "I have changed over the years. I grew a beard, changed my hairstyle. Besides, she had never seen me in a security guard uniform. Believe me, the last thing she would think of is a successful jewelry chain owner pretending to be a security guard." Thomas was silent for a long time, looking at his friend. "What if she really is seeing someone? What would you do?" Richard turned to the window. "I just want to know the truth. Who he is. What kind of person. That's it?" Thomas asked incredulously. "That's all." "You're lying," Thomas sighed. "I've known you for 20 years. You have never been able to let go of what you consider yours." Richard turned around sharply. "She's not a thing. I just—" He trailed off, searching for words. "I need to know if she's really happy. I need to know if I did the right thing when—" "When what?" asked Thomas softly. "It doesn't matter," Richard cut him off. "Are you going to help me or not?" Thomas looked at his friend for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but on one condition. You have to work like a real bodyguard. No indulgences. And if I notice anything suspicious, I'll fire you immediately." "Agreed," Richard quickly replied. "And one more thing," Thomas stood up. "If Rosie recognizes you, I had no idea. Do you understand?" "Of course." When the door closed behind Thomas, Richard went back to the window. The city below was bustling, people hurrying about their business, unaware that upstairs one man was preparing to completely change his life for the ghostly chance of finding out the truth. "I'm sorry, Rosie," he whispered, "but I have to know." The next morning, Richard called his CFO and handed over the management of the store chain to him indefinitely. The official story was that he was going on a long business trip to Europe, but in reality, in fact, in a week's time, a new security guard will take over at the Grand Valley residential complex, and the strangest story of his life will begin. The first rays of the sun were shining on the facade of the Grand Valley residential complex as Richard White approached his new workplace. The security guard's dark blue uniform fit him unusually well, and his black baseball cap with the security company's logo cast a shadow over his face. He ran a hand through his beard, which had grown even thicker over the past week, completely changing his usual look. "Good morning, Mr. White." Peter, the the guard he was supposed to replace greeted him. "Thomas told me you're the new guy." "Yes, first day." Richard tried to speak in a lower voice than usual. "Anything special I should know about?" "Well, it's pretty standard. Walk the grounds every 2 hours, check the cameras, register visitors. Oh, and be extra careful of Mrs. Carter on the 5th floor. She's paranoid, always thinks someone is walking on her balcony." Richard nodded, feeling his heart start to beat faster. "The 5th floor. That's where Rosie lives. And we have a few special residents," Peter continued. "For example, Mrs. Rosie Anderson on the 5th floor. She's the ex-wife of some rich jeweler. She's a very nice woman, always says hello." Richard felt his throat go dry. "Rosie took her maiden name after the divorce. I see," he managed to get out. When Peter left, Richard sat down at the security desk and began to peer at the monitors. On one of them he saw a familiar balcony. His heart ached with memories. How many evenings they had spent there together, looking at the city and dreaming of the future. At 9 in the morning, the elevator opened and Richard froze. Rosie looked stunning in a cream business suit. Her brown hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and she had a slight smile on her face. She seemed happy, carefree, and for some reason that hurt the most. "Good morning," she greeted as she passed the security desk. "Are you new here?" "Yes, ma'am." Richard pulled his baseball cap's visor down. "John Brown, at your service." "Nice to meet you, John," she smiled even wider. "I'm Rosie Anderson, 5th floor, her perfume, the same scent he gave her on their last anniversary. Does she still wear it?" "Why?" "Have a nice day, Mrs. Anderson," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. All day, Richard watched her through the security cameras. She came home from work around 6, carrying bags from the grocery store. She stopped to talk to her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She was laughing, telling her something. Her laugh, God, how he missed that laugh. Around 8 in the evening, he noticed her walking out onto the balcony in a light house dress. The wind played with her hair, now loose. She looked so peaceful, so free, happy without him. "You're being stupid," he whispered to himself. "She's moving on, and you're stuck in the past." But then he noticed her take her phone out of her pocket, look at the screen, and suddenly her face changed. A shadow of sadness flashed across it, so fast you'd think it was a play of light. But Richard knew that face too well. He knew every feature, every emotion. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Anderson?" he asked as she passed his post on her way out. "Yes, of course," she replied, but her smile seemed strained. "It's just, some dates make us think back, don't they?" Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Today was the anniversary of their first date. Does she remember? "Sometimes the past is best left in the past," he said, trying to sound like an outsider. "Maybe," she replied quietly. "But some memories are impossible to let go of, even if you really want to." She quickly walked to the exit, and Richard remained standing, feeling something bitter and sweet at the same time in his chest. She remembers. She remembers too. Late at night, sitting in his temporary apartment near the Grand Valley, Richard looked out over the city and thought about everything that had happened that day. Rosie looked happy, successful, confident. Maybe his plan was a mistake. Maybe it was better to leave things as they were. But that moment of sadness, that glance at the phone, something told him that there was more to this perfect picture than meets the eye. And he was going to find out what it was. Richard took off his baseball cap and looked at his reflection in the window. Who is he now? A rich businessman playing spy? An ex-husband who can't let go of the past? Or just a fool risking everything for a phantom chance? The only thing he was sure of was that this was just the beginning, and if he wanted to find out the truth, he would have to play his role perfectly. Because the price of a mistake is too high. He might lose even the fragile opportunity to see her every day that he had gained through his crazy plan. He pulled an old photo out of his pocket. He and Rosie on the beach, happy, in love, how everything had changed. And is it possible to get back at least some of what they've lost? "Good night, Rosie," he whispered, looking toward the Grand Valley. "I hope one day you will understand why I am doing this." Rosie had always prided herself on her intuition. In her 15 years in real estate, she had learned to trust her gut instincts, and now something was telling her that something was wrong with the new security guard. Perhaps it was the way he always lowered the visor of his baseball cap when she walked by, or the way his eyes seemed to constantly follow her through the security cameras. Sitting in a cozy cafe called Margarita on the corner of Fifth Avenue, Rosie was stirring an untouched cup of cappuccino with a spoon. Across from her sat Julia, her best friend since college, who always knew how to put things in order. "Maybe I'm paranoid," Rosie sighed, "but something about him worries me. You know how it is when you feel someone else's eyes on you?" Julia put down her croissant and looked at her friend carefully. "Did he do something inappropriate? Did he hit on you? Did he threaten you?" No, nothing like that," Rosie shook her head. "On the contrary, he's extremely polite, maybe even too polite. So what's the problem?" Rosie paused, searching for words. "Yesterday, I was coming back late from a meeting with clients. He asked me if I was okay because he noticed that I've been working late lately. How does he know my usual schedule? He's only been working here for 2 weeks." Julia looked out the window thoughtfully. Maybe the other guards have told him, or maybe he's just observant. "And the day before yesterday," Rosie continued, "he commented on my new bracelet. He said that the sapphires really suit my eyes. Is a bodyguard supposed to notice such details?" That's really strange," Julia agreed. "What's his name?" "John Brown. But you know what's weird? When he speaks, sometimes his tone reminds me of Richard." Julia sat up straight. "You think that?" "No, that's impossible," Rosie waved her hand. "Richard is somewhere in Europe right now, expanding his business. Besides, he would never—" She trailed off, remembering her ex-husband. "He's too proud for that. But something is bothering you?" "Yes. Yesterday I deliberately mentioned my ex-husband. And you know what? It seemed to me that the eyes of that guard, they changed, like he knew what I was talking about." Julia leaned closer. "Honey, maybe you're just, looking for Richard where he isn't? It's been so many years, but I can see you're still—" "No," Rosie interrupted her sharply. "That's all in the past. I just want to feel safe in my own home." She pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. "You know what? I'm going to call the security agency, just to check it out." Rosie dialed the number of Safe House and waited. A friendly female voice answered after the second ring. "Hello, this is Safe House." "Hello, my name is Rosie Anderson, and I am a resident of the Grand Valley Residential Complex. I would like to talk to you about your new employee, John Brown. One moment, please. Yes, I see him in our system. Is there a problem?" Rosie hesitated. He's been acting strange. He's been watching the residents too closely, especially me. He asks personal questions. I don't feel comfortable with him." There is a short silence on the other end of the line. "Miss Anderson, thank you for your call. We will definitely check this information and have a conversation with Mr. Brown. Perhaps he is simply taking his responsibilities too seriously. Please do so as soon as possible." As she hung up the phone, Rosie noticed Julia's surprised look. "What? I have a right to feel safe." "Of course you do, dear. It's just, are you sure it has nothing to do with your divorce anniversary coming up?" Rosie felt her cheeks flush. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Well, you've been more tense lately. Maybe we should finally talk about what happened. In 15 years, you've never told me why you really broke up." Rosie turned to the window. It was starting to rain outside, drops trickling down the glass, blurring the outlines of passers-by. "Some things are better left in the past," she said quietly. But the past doesn't let you go, does it? Julia asked softly. You still wear that perfume he gave you. You still live in the same neighborhood. You still don't let yourself. That's enough. Rosie stood up abruptly. I have to go to work. Rosie, wait. Julia grabbed her arm. I'm just worried about you. Maybe you should, start dating. Peter from sales has been showing interest in you for a while. Not now, Rosie shook her head. I have an important project, a new apartment complex. You always have a project, Julia sighed. Do you know what Richard would say? Luckily, he's not here to hear it, Rosie said, and headed for the exit. In the taxi, she took out a mirror and looked at her reflection. New wrinkles had appeared in the corners of her eyes, but overall she hadn't changed much over the years. Would Richard notice the difference if he saw her now? Nonsense, she whispered. He's somewhere in Europe, buying diamonds and enjoying himself. And this security guard, just a coincidence, nothing more. But then why does her heart feel so strangely tight every time she passes the guard's post? And why does it seem that behind John Brown's dark glasses there is something familiar, something she's been trying to forget all this time? Her phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was the security company. Miss Anderson? We spoke to Mr. Brown. He assured us that he was just doing his job properly, but we warned him to keep a professional distance. Thank you, Rosie said, feeling strangely disappointed. I hope that helps. She hung up the phone and closed her eyes. Maybe Julia was right. Maybe all these suspicions were just a way of not thinking about the fact that their anniversary was approaching. 15 years. It seems like an eternity and just a moment at the same time. Maybe it's time to finally tell someone the truth about what happened that night. About the real reason for their divorce? Rosie shook her head. No, some secrets are best kept to oneself, even if they slowly eat you up inside. Richard sat in Thomas's office, trying to keep a calm expression on his face, even though he was seething inside. His plan could have been ruined because of one mistake. She's filed a formal complaint. Thomas threw a folder on the table. She says you're watching her too closely, asking her personal questions. What kind of amateurishness is that, Richard? I was just trying to— You're going to hell, Thomas interrupted him. 15 years have passed and you're still acting like a teenager in love. She's not stupid, Richard. Rosie has always been a perceptive woman. Richard ran a hand over his face. I'll be more careful. More careful? Thomas huffed. Do you even realize what you're doing? 15 years. During this time, normal people create new families, have children, and move on with their lives. And what are you doing? Dressing up as a security guard to spy on your ex-wife. I just want to know that she's happy. Is that why you're acting like a stalker? Thomas shook his head. Look, man, I understand how you feel, but it's not normal. She noticed you were paying too much attention. Her complaint says you comment on her jewelry, you know her schedule. Richard turned to the window. Downstairs, life was in full swing as people hurried about their business, unaware of the drama unfolding in the security company's office. I'll fix it, he said quietly. I'll just do my job. No comments, no talk. I hope so, Thomas sighed. Because next time I won't be able to cover for you. And one more thing. He was silent. Are you sure you want to know the truth about her personal life? 15 years is a long time. Richard didn't answer. He had returned to his desk with the firm intention of being as inconspicuous as possible. Now he only nodded when Rosie walked by, not even allowing himself to look after her. But fate decided to test his resolve that very evening. Around 7 o'clock, a black Lexus pulled up to the complex. A tall man of about 50 in an elegant suit got out. He confidently walked to the elevator without even looking in the direction of the guards. Good evening, Mr. Donovan, the concierge greeted him. Mrs. Anderson warned me about your visit. Richard felt something tighten inside. George Donovan. He remembered that name. After their divorce, it was George who had supported Rosie, helped her move, been there for her. Through the surveillance cameras, Richard saw Rosie meet the guest at the door of her apartment. She looked happy, smiling. She was wearing an elegant black dress, the same one Richard had once given her for her birthday. "George," her voice came from the speakers of the surveillance system. "I'm so happy to see you." They hugged, and Richard felt his hands involuntarily clench into fists. 15 years. Could it be that they had been together all this time? Maybe George had been waiting for his chance since they were married. The next 2 hours seemed like an eternity. Richard tried to concentrate on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to the 5th floor. What were they doing up there? What were they talking about? Why is she wearing that dress? When George finally got out of the elevator, he had a satisfied smile on his face. He whistled something as he headed for the exit. Richard noticed that the man's tie was a little loose and that there was a lipstick mark on his shirt collar. "Have a good evening," George said as he passed. Richard just nodded, feeling jealousy well up inside him. He looked at the monitors where Rosie was watching the guest leave from the balcony. Did she look happy, satisfied, or just calm? Late at night, Richard sat for a long time, staring at the monitor as if he were somewhere far away. 15 years ago, he made a decision that changed their lives. At the time, he thought he was doing the right thing, that it was the best thing for everyone. And now, "Mr. Brown," a voice suddenly came over the radio. "We have an emergency on the 5th floor." Mrs. Anderson reported a suspicious noise on the balcony. Richard jumped up and ran to the elevator. His heart was pounding. Had something happened? But when he got to the 5th floor, it turned out that it was just a vase left on the balcony that had fallen in a gust of wind. "I'm sorry to bother you," Rosie said, standing in the doorway in her bathrobe. "I've been overly cautious lately." "It's all right, ma'am," he replied, trying not to look her in the eye. "It's just my job. You know—" She suddenly fell silent, as if hesitating. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." Richard felt his back go cold. "It must be a coincidence, ma'am." She agreed, but there was a strange note in her voice. "You know, 15 years is a long time. Sometimes it seems like it all happened in another life, with other people." "Good night, Mrs. Anderson," he said quickly, and walked to the elevator. "Good night, Mr. Brown," she replied, and he thought she sounded slightly ironic. Returning to his desk, Richard stared at the monitors for a long time. George Donovan. Had he really been by her side all these years? Comforting, supporting, waiting for his chance? And does he, Richard, have the right to be jealous after 15 years of divorce? But what worried him the most was that Rosie seemed to be suspicious, and that meant he would have to be even more careful. Because if she found out the truth, if she realized who was hiding under the security guard's uniform, then all his plans, all his hopes, would come crashing down like that vase on the balcony. "God, what am I doing?" he whispered, looking at his reflection in the dark monitor. 15 years. How can you get back what you lost 15 years ago? But there was no answer. There was only the night, soft music from someone's apartment, and bitter thoughts that time does not heal. It just teaches you to live with pain. Every morning the mail came to Grand Valley. As a security guard, Richard had access to the residents' mailboxes, a common security procedure. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't resist the temptation to learn more about Rosie's life. Bills, advertising brochures, a real estate business magazine, and suddenly, an invitation to a charity event from a local art foundation. "Dear Mrs. Anderson, we invite you and your partner to attend." Partner? Richard's heart sank. "Good morning, John." Rosie's voice brought him out of his thoughts. She was standing in front of the security desk in an elegant ivory business suit. "I have an important letter from a law firm coming today. Could you please let me know when it arrives?" "Of course, ma'am," he replied, trying not to let his excitement show. During the day, Richard watched as flowers were delivered to the house 3 times, large bouquets of roses with a card he couldn't read. Rosie accepted them with a slight smile, but without much enthusiasm, as if it were something familiar. In the evening, when she returned home, she smelled of expensive perfume and restaurant food. When the concierge asked her about dinner, Rosie just smiled mysteriously. Richard felt his insides turning with jealousy. Who was this mysterious admirer? Was it George, or perhaps someone new in her life? After a week of observations, he noticed a certain pattern. The flowers came every Tuesday and Friday, always at 3 o'clock, always from the same flower shop, Bloom & Green on Maple Street. One day, taking advantage of his position as a security guard, he intercepted a note with the bouquet. "Looking forward to dinner. Yours, P." The letter P haunted him. Peter, Paul, Patrick. Richard began to notice the smallest details. How Rosie had changed her hairstyle. Now her hair was shorter, with a fashionable cascade. How she wore dresses more often instead of the usual suits. How her eyes shone when she talked to someone on the phone, stepping into the corner of the hall. "Mrs. Anderson has been glowing lately," Martha, the concierge, once remarked. "She must be seeing someone." "Really?" Richard asked indifferently, feeling his heart sink. "Oh, it's so romantic," Martha continued. "You know, she's been alone for a long time. All these years she's been devoting herself to her work. And now, these flowers, dinners in a restaurant." Every day it became more and more difficult for Richard to remain calm. He could almost physically feel the opportunity to fix everything, to bring it back, slipping away from him. One evening he noticed Rosie coming home later than usual. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes sparkled with happiness. She was humming a tune as she walked to the elevator. "Nice evening, Mrs. Anderson?" he couldn't help but ask. "Oh, wonderful, John," she replied with a smile. "You know, sometimes life has such surprises." That night Richard could not sleep. He was lying in his rented apartment looking at the ceiling, thinking about all the signs he had seen lately. Flowers, dinners, phone calls, new dresses. Was he too late? Had she really found someone else? The next day he decided to act more decisively. While making his rounds, he accidentally looked into the trash can by her door. Among the papers he noticed a brochure for a restaurant called La Maison, with a red marker circled around the time. 19 o'clock, Friday, the same day as the flowers. Richard felt his hands shaking. Was he finally going to find out who this mysterious suitor was? But he was worried about something else. As he watched Rosie through the surveillance cameras, he saw how she had changed. There was a lightness in her gait, a special sparkle in her eyes. She looked happy, and that was what killed him the most. "You've been tense lately, John," Martha once said. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing," he replied, adjusting his baseball cap. "Just work stuff." "You know," the concierge continued, "I've been working here for a long time and I've seen all kinds of things. But the worst thing is when people live in the past, not giving themselves a chance to be happy in the present." Richard looked at her in surprise. Did she really suspect something? But Martha had already turned her attention to her papers, leaving him alone with his thoughts. On Friday, he decided he had to see for himself. His shift ended at 6, just as Rosie usually left for her mystery dinners. He planned to follow her, to find out who this mysterious P was. But is he ready for the truth? Can he stand the sight of Rosie happy with another man? And most importantly, does he have the right to interfere in her life after everything that has happened? These questions ran through his mind as he watched the monitors, waiting for Friday. Friday, which could change everything, or completely destroy his hopes for the return of the past. Friday morning at Grand Valley began as usual. Richard was checking his mail when he noticed Rosie coming down the stairs instead of taking the elevator as usual. She looked thoughtful, almost distant. "Good morning, Miss Anderson," he greeted, trying to keep his usual security voice. Rosie stopped, looking at him intently. Something in her gaze made Richard tense. "You know, John," she said suddenly, "I've been wanting to ask you something for a long time. Would you like to have coffee with me? I have some free time before work." Richard froze. It was unexpected and dangerous, but he couldn't refuse. "I'm afraid I'm on duty. You can have coffee here in the lobby," she smiled. "I'll bring it from the coffee shop across the street." 10 minutes later, they were sitting in a cozy corner of the lobby. Rosie held a paper cappuccino cup in her hands, looking thoughtfully at her companion. "You remind me of someone," she finally said. "Someone I knew a long time ago." Richard felt his throat go dry. Really? It must be a coincidence. Rosie took a sip of her coffee. "You know, sometimes life plays strange tricks on us. We meet people who remind us of the past, and suddenly all the old feelings come to the surface. Do you miss someone?" Richard asked cautiously. Rosie was silent for a long time, looking out the window. "I don't know. To be honest, for a long time I thought it was love, that I still loved him. But now—" She shook her head. "Now I realize that it's more like a resentment. Resentment at the way it ended, at the words that were not spoken, at the opportunities that were lost." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Maybe he had his reasons? "Oh, I'm sure he did," Rosie smiled bitterly. "We all have reasons for our actions. But, you know, sometimes I wake up at night and think, what if we had just talked? What if, instead of silence and pride, we had tried to understand each other?" "And what would you say to him now?" Richard asked quietly, forgetting his caution. Rosie gave him a strange look. "You know, John, sometimes you have the same intonation as him, the same look when you think no one is watching." She suddenly laughed. "But that's nonsense, of course. He's somewhere in Europe right now, buying diamonds and expanding his business." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you following his life?" "No, of course not," she waved her hand. "I just sometimes hear news from mutual friends. You know, I'm even glad that he's doing well. It helps to let go. Let go." "Yes." Rosie finished her coffee. "You know, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. We can't live in the past forever. We can't hold a grudge in our hearts instead of love. It poisons us from the inside." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. What if he came back? What if he tried to explain? Rosie stood up, about to leave. "You know, John, sometimes it's best to leave the past in the past. By the way," she suddenly smiled, "I have an important dinner tonight. Don't be surprised if I come back late." She walked away, leaving him with 1,000 unspoken words. Richard watched her go, feeling his insides turn upside down at her words about resentment instead of love. He spent the whole day in a fog waiting for the evening. At 7, Rosie came down the hall in an exquisite black dress. She was wearing the same perfume she always wore. "Good evening, John," she said as she passed. Richard waited until she got into a taxi and quickly changed into civilian clothes. He had to know who this mysterious P was. La Maison was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Richard took a table in the far corner where he could see the entire room. When he saw who joined Rosie, his heart sank. Peter Collins, the head of sales from her real estate agency, a tall blond man of 45, always impeccably dressed with impeccable manners, the exact opposite of Richard himself. They were sitting, laughing, talking. Peter was telling something, actively gesturing, and Rosie listened to him with a slight smile. At one point he covered her hand with his, and she did not pull it away. Richard felt his insides turning over. He looked at this scene and realized that this was her new life, a life in which there is no place for old grievances and unspoken words, a life in which she had finally let go of the past. When he returned home, he sat in the dark for a long time looking at the city. Her words were replaying in his head. We cannot hold a grudge in our hearts instead of love. What had he been holding in his heart all these years? What made him dress as a security guard, spy on his ex-wife? Was it love? Or was it the same resentment disguised as a feeling that had long since died? The phone vibrated. A message from Thomas. How was your shift? Richard didn't answer. What could he say? That he had spent the day listening to the woman he supposedly still loved talk about the importance of letting go of the past. That he had watched her date another man. Maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past. But then why does it hurt so much? And why does it seem that the real conversation between them is still to come? Returning home after dinner with Peter, Rosie felt strangely elated. She kicked off her high-heeled shoes and went out onto the balcony, breathing in the fresh night air. The evening turned out to be surprisingly pleasant. Light conversation, delicious food, and a relaxed atmosphere. Peter turned out to be a great conversationalist, without the tension and omissions that had plagued her in previous relationships. "Did you have a good time?" came the security guard's voice from the lower floor. "Yes, thank you, John," she replied, leaning over the railing. And suddenly something in his posture and the way he kept his hands in his pockets made her freeze. That gesture. She had seen it 1,000 times. Rosie quickly moved away from the balcony, her heart pounding. No, this was impossible. But then the memories began to surface one by one, forming a clear picture. His comment about the sapphire bracelet, "It matches your eyes." These were the words Richard said to her when he gave her the jewelry many years ago, knowing her schedule, her habits, even her favorite parking spot. The way he always lowered his head when she walked by, hiding his eyes under the visor of his baseball cap. And most importantly, his voice. When he was forgotten, the same intonations, the same timbre would come through. "Oh my God," Rosie whispered, sinking into her chair. It was him. Her first impulse was to call the security company to expose him, but something stopped her. Curiosity? A desire to understand? Or perhaps an old habit of analyzing his every move? She went to the mirror, looking at her reflection. What made him take this step? Why this masquerade performance? Memories of their divorce came flooding back to her. Back then, everything seemed so black and white, right and wrong. They were both younger, more hot-tempered, more stubborn. Each believed that the truth was on their side. Rosie pulled out an old photo of her and Richard on vacation in Italy, happy, smiling. But now she saw something she hadn't noticed before, the tension in his smile, the fatigue in his eyes. They were both working too hard at the time, building careers, forgetting about the main thing. The phone rang. It was Peter. "Hi," his voice sounded warm and calm. "I wanted to thank you again for a wonderful evening." "And thank you," she replied, feeling her lips involuntarily stretch into a smile. "Can we do it again next week?" Rosie hesitated for just a moment. "I would love to." She hung up the phone and went back out onto the balcony. Richard, or rather, John, was still at his post. She watched as he methodically checked the cameras, made his rounds, and talked to the residents. A professional security guard, if not for the small details that gave him away. The next morning she deliberately lingered near his post. "John, do you know what time it is?" "8:30, ma'am," he replied, at which point his hand automatically reached for his left wrist, an old gesture Richard used when he was nervous. "Thank you. By the way," she paused deliberately, "do you know a good jeweler? I want to repair an old bracelet." He flinched slightly. "I'm afraid not, ma'am. I don't know much about jewelry." Liar, Rosie thought. The owner of the largest chain of jewelry stores in town doesn't know much about jewelry. Throughout the day, she caught his eye several times. Now that she knew the truth, it didn't make her anxious, but rather a strange feeling of pity. Disappointment? She couldn't quite put her finger on it. In the evening, on her way home from work, she deliberately dropped a folder of documents right in front of his post. Richard rushed over to help, and as their hands simultaneously reached for the same sheet, she could clearly see the familiar scar on his thumb, a reminder of their first attempt at cooking dinner together. "Thank you," she said, looking him straight in the eye. For a moment she thought he understood that he was about to confess, but he just nodded and stepped back. Late that night, lying in bed, Rosie thought about the strange irony of life. 15 years ago, they had divorced because they couldn't find a common language, couldn't trust each other. And now he was hiding behind a stranger's identity, and she was hiding the fact that she recognized him. But the strangest thing was that somewhere deep inside she realized that their divorce was the right decision. They were too different, too stubborn, too focused on their own ambitions. Perhaps that's why now, with Peter, everything felt different, simpler, calmer, without the all-consuming passion that had once burned their marriage. "Good evening, John," she said the next morning as she passed the guard post. "You know, I've been thinking. Sometimes the best way to find answers is to just ask them directly. Don't you think?" She saw him tense up, but continued. "Although, of course, some people prefer the hard way. Have a nice day." Rosie could feel his confused gaze as she walked to the elevator. She knew that sooner or later this game would end. But for now, she wondered how long he could continue his masquerade. And most importantly, what made a successful businessman turn into a bodyguard? Perhaps the answer was simpler than it seemed. Perhaps he, like her, simply could not let go of the past without realizing what had gone wrong. But life had long ago put everything in its place, and their paths had diverged for a reason. Rosie smiled as she remembered last night's dinner with Peter. Sometimes you have to let go of the old to open up to the new. And perhaps the best way to help Richard is to let him realize that for himself. In the evening light, the corridors of the Grand Valley seemed especially quiet. Richard was just finishing up his usual rounds when he received a call on his radio. "John, it's Mrs. Anderson on the 5th floor. I think I have a problem with the door. Could you please come up?" Something in her voice struck him as odd, but he answered as professionally as ever. "Of course, ma'am. I'll be there in a minute." When he got to the 5th floor, he saw Rosie standing at her door in her homemade silk robe. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she had a strange smile on her face. "Good evening, ma'am." What exactly happened to the door? Instead of answering, Rosie simply pulled the handle, and the door opened easily. "Can we finally talk, Richard?" He felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. All these weeks of disguise, all the attempts to be invisible, it all crumbled with one phrase. "How long have you known?" he managed to get out. "Long enough." She took a step to the side, inviting him in. "You know, for the owner of a jewelry chain, you're pretty bad at pretending not to know anything about jewelry." Everything in the apartment was almost exactly as he remembered. The same paintings on the walls, the same sofa. Only now there was a vase of flowers on the coffee table, probably from Peter. "Sit down," Rosie pointed to the chair. "Would you like some tea, or maybe something stronger? I think we could both use it. Whiskey, if you don't mind." She pulled out a bottle and 2 glasses. Richard noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. "So what's the point of all this?" Rosie asked, sitting down across from him. "Why this masquerade show?" Richard stared into his glass for a long time before answering. "I wanted to know if you were happy, and for that you had to dress up as a security guard?" She sounded bitter. "Couldn't you have just called me, after what I said to you that night?" He smiled bitterly. "I thought you wouldn't even want to listen to me." Rosie took a sip. "You mean the night you accused me of cheating? When you screamed that I had ruined our marriage because of my career? Or the time you said I wasn't worthy of the white name?" "I was a fool," Richard said quietly. "I was jealous. I saw how you stayed late at work, how you talked to clients. And instead of talking to you, You ruined everything, she finished. You know what the worst part is? I really loved you, and I loved my job too. And I didn't understand why I had to choose. And now? He looked into her eyes. What do you feel now? Rosie got up and went to the window. You know, when I realized it was you, I thought I would feel anger or hurt. But you know what I felt? Relief. Relief. Yes, she turned to him. Because I finally realized what had been holding me back all these years. I just wanted to hear it. Your apology. Your admission that you were wrong. Richard put down his glass and walked over to her. Rosie, No. She raised her hand, stopping him. Let me finish. All these years I thought I couldn't move on because I loved you. But it wasn't love. It was resentment. Unfinished business. And you know what? Now that you're here, now that we're finally talking, I feel like I can let it all go. But what about us? His voice trembled. Is there no chance to make things right? Rosie smiled softly. Richard, look at you. You dressed up as a security guard to spy on me. That's not love. This is obsession. And we both deserve better. She walked over to him and touched his cheek lightly. You were an important part of my life, but that life ended 15 years ago. And maybe that's why you're here, so that we can both finally realize that and let go. I saw you with him, Richard said quietly. With Peter. Are you happy? I'm calm, she replied after a pause. For the first time in a long time, I'm just calm. And you know what? It feels right. Richard walked to the window, looking out at the city at night. You know what's funny? I thought that when I finally saw you up close, when I talked to you, everything would come back. But you're right. It's not love. It's the ghost of the past, Rosie finished. And it's time for us both to say goodbye to it. She walked to the door and opened it. I think it's time for you to end this masquerade, Richard. Go build your life. He walked slowly to the door but stopped at the threshold. I'm sorry for everything, for that night, for the insults, I have forgiven you, she answered simply. I forgave you a long time ago. I was just waiting for you to realize it. When the door closed, Rosie stood there for a long time, leaning against it. Tears glistened in her eyes, but they were tears of relief. Finally, she could let go of the past and move on. At the same time, Richard was going down the stairs, feeling strangely light and at the same time painful. He came looking for love and found forgiveness, and perhaps that was exactly what they both needed. Richard was looking at a new collection of diamond jewelry in the window of his flagship store. In the years since that conversation with Rosie, his business has become even more successful. He has opened 3 new stores and signed a contract with a well-known European supplier. Honey, these earrings are just gorgeous. Carol, his new life partner, gently touched his hand. She was 10 years younger than he was and worked as an art director in a large advertising agency. Refined, elegant, intelligent. Do you want to try it on? He asked, taking out the keys to the window. Not now, she smiled. We'll be late for dinner with my parents. Richard nodded and followed her out the door. Everything was right, measured, calm. Carol understood him, respected his space, never made a scene. She was comfortable, and that suited him. But sometimes, especially in the evenings when he was alone in his office, the memories came back. Not painful, as before, but rather melancholy. He often thought about those words of Rosie's. You were an important part of my life, but that life is over. Last month, he accidentally saw her with Peter at the mall. They were choosing furniture, laughing, looking, happy. Rosie was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, no makeup, but she seemed so alive, so real. Richard left quickly, not wanting to be seen. Mr. White, you have a call from Antwerp. The secretary's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Yes, connect me. Work had always been his lifeline, After that night, he plunged headlong into expanding his business. He opened a representative office in Europe and started working with new designers. Success came easily, perhaps because the inner tension that had tormented him for years finally disappeared. "You seem pensive tonight," Carol said as they returned from dinner. "Did something happen?" "No, nothing," he smiled. "I'm just tired." She didn't ask any more questions, one of the qualities he appreciated about her. Carol never pressed, never demanded explanations. Perhaps that's why their relationship had lasted for 6 months, the longest since he'd broken up with Rosie. At home, he pulled out an old box of documents. He needed to check something for a new contract. Among the papers, he accidentally found a photo of him and Rosie at the opening of their first store. Young, happy, full of hope. Who would have thought that it would end like this? Probably the lucky man is the one who doesn't think for the rest of his life that he missed the one, Richard thought as he looked at the picture. But can you control such things? How can you forbid your heart to remember? He remembered how he felt when he left her apartment a year ago. It seemed then that life was over. But it went on, day after day, week after week, and gradually the pain dulled, leaving behind something like a light sadness. Carol often asked him about his ex-wife, but he answered evasively. How can he explain to another woman that a part of his heart will forever remain with the one who taught him to love? How can he admit that sometimes, when he wakes up at night, he can still smell her perfume? "Are you happy?" Carol once asked him. "I am calm," he answered with the same words he had once said to Rosie. And it was true. After that evening a year ago, he finally realized that sometimes peace is more important than passion. Sometimes respect and understanding can replace passionate love. Now, sitting in his office, he looked out at the city at night and thought about the strange twists and turns of fate, about how often we look for happiness where it no longer exists, about how difficult it is to let go of the past, even when you realize that it is necessary. With Carol, everything was simple and clear. She did not demand the impossible from him, did not expect him to become a different person. They spent weekends together, went to the theater, traveled. It was a mature, calm relationship between two adults, but sometimes, when he looked at her, he found himself wondering if it was possible to build a happy life without the overwhelming feeling he once had for Rosie. Is respect and peace enough for true happiness? There was no answer. There was only the certainty that life should be lived with dignity, without constantly looking back. And if fate decreed that his greatest love was in the past, then he had to accept it and move on. In the evening, when Carol fell asleep next to him, he lay awake for a long time, thinking about the strange twists and turns of fate, about how sometimes you realize the most important things in life too late, and about how sometimes the greatest wisdom is the ability to let go of what you can't get back. "Good night, Rosie," he whispered into the darkness, allowing himself this little weakness for the last time. "Be happy." And then he closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would be a new day. A day he would live with his present life, with his present choices, without passionate love, but with respect and peace. Because sometimes that is what true wisdom is, accepting what you have and being grateful for it. "Rosie, will you marry me?" These words were spoken in the cozy kitchen of their shared house, where they moved 3 months ago. Rosie froze with a cup of coffee in her hands. Peter was on one knee in front of her, holding a small velvet box. Sunlight flooded into the kitchen, playing on the edges of the ring with a delicate sapphire. The first thought that flashed through her mind was shock. Marriage? Again? Memories of her first wedding flashed before her eyes. A young bride in a white dress, full of hopes and dreams. Everything seemed so simple and clear then. She took a deep breath. "Are you sure?" Peter stood up and gently took her hands. "Rosie, I am a grown man. I was married. I have a grown daughter. I know what I want from life, and I want to spend it with you." She looked into his eyes, calm, confident, full of love. Not the youthful passion that burns everything in its path, but a deep, mature feeling. "Yes," she answered, feeling a smile spread across her face. "Yes, I will marry you." Peter put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been there. Rosie thought it was symbolic, just like their relationship, which seemed so natural, so right. All day long she found herself smiling for no reason. At work her colleagues noticed the ring, and congratulations, hugs, and questions began. Rosie answered simply, "Yes, they are happy, yes. The wedding will be modest, only for the closest ones." In the evening, sitting on the terrace of their new home, they talked about the future. "You know," Rosie said, looking up at the stars, "I've been thinking about children." Peter put his arm around her shoulders. "Do you want to adopt a child?" "Maybe." She leaned against his shoulder. "Not right now, but I see how you interact with Emily. What a wonderful father you are. And I think I'd like to give that love to someone else." "We won't rush into anything," he replied gently. "We have time to think about it, to prepare. This is a serious step." And that was the whole point of their relationship. They took their time, didn't try to jump through the stages. Every decision was made calmly, carefully, with full understanding of the consequences. Going to bed, Rosie thought about how her life had changed over the past year. A new job. She became a partner in a real estate agency. A new home. Not a luxurious apartment in Grand Valley, but a cozy cottage with a garden. New plans, new dreams. She hardly ever thought about Richard. Sometimes, driving past his jewelry stores, she would feel a slight prickle-knot pain, just a memory of her past life. But it was like watching an old movie. You remember the plot, but you don't experience the emotions as sharply anymore. Once she met him in a supermarket. He was with a woman, a tall brunette. They just nodded to each other and parted ways, and it seemed right, no drama, no tension, just two people whose paths had once crossed and then parted. "What are you thinking about?" Peter asked, noticing her thoughtful look. "About life," she smiled. "About how everything is strange and yet right." He kissed her forehead. "Do you know what I love most about you? Your wisdom. You know how to appreciate the moment without regretting the past or fearing the future." Rosie thought it came with experience. She used to live in the future, building a career, dreaming of success. Then she got stuck in the past, in memories, images, unspoken words. And now she has finally learned to live in the present. The next morning she was sorting through old things to make room for Peter's books. In a box of old documents, she found a certificate of her first marriage. This paper had once seemed so important, but now... Rosie calmly put it in the folder with the other documents. It was just a part of her history, nothing more. Life went on calmly and smoothly. She and Peter had planned a modest ceremony in the garden with just their closest friends and family. His daughter Emily was helping with the organization, and Rosie felt herself gradually becoming part of this family. "You know," Emily said one day, "I'm glad Dad met you. He's so happy now." "We're both happy," Rosie replied, and it was the truth. Sometimes she thought about how life is different for everyone, that sometimes you have to go through pain and disappointment to realize that true happiness can be quiet and calm. Not a fireworks display of emotions, but the warm light of a home. One evening she was sitting in the garden watching Peter water her favorite roses. The sun was setting, painting the sky in delicate pastel colors. Suddenly she realized that this was it, happiness. Not in loud words and passionate embraces, but in these simple moments, in the feeling of complete peace and the correctness of everything that is happening. "I love you," she said when he came and sat down next to her. "I love you too," he replied simply, taking her hand. At that moment, Rosie finally let go of the past. All the grievances, all the What ifs melted away in the warm evening air. Only the present remained with its simple joys, mature love, and plans for the future that they would build together. And somewhere in the city, Richard also found his own way to be happy. And it was right. Everyone has their own path, their own destiny, their own way to find peace in their hearts. Life goes on, and sometimes it brings us exactly what we need. Not what we dreamed of in our youth, but what makes us truly happy. You just need to be able to accept it and be grateful for every moment, every gift of fate. And when Peter hugged her in the evening, looking at the stars, Rosie knew that she was exactly where she should be, with a man who understands and accepts her for who she is. No drama, no need to prove or change anything. Just two adults who decided to share their lives and make them better together. And the next morning, when the sun once again flooded their home with soft light, Rosie and Peter made breakfast together, a simple but warm moment that became a symbol of everything they had created. Life was made up of these everyday rituals where no words were needed to be happy. Rosie realized that in these cozy mornings, in their care for each other and their quiet joy, was hidden everything she had once so timidly sought. This was their world, perfect in its simplicity, sincere in every moment, and now it contained everything she really needed.